Hello, my name is Paula Dugan. I'm the Children's Supervisor at the Needham Free Public Library. Behind me is Pendower Cove off the coast of Cornwall, England, near the little village of Zennor, where one day a mermaid named Marvorin popped her head up out of the water. She sat down on the rocks, swishing her tail in the cool water, raising her face up to the bright warmth of the sun. She took out her coral comb and a mirror that was as smooth and shiny as calm sunlit water. She began combing her hair when she heard a sound. It was a beautiful sound. It was singing. Mermaids love to sing, and they have beautiful voices. They sing when the sea is whipped into a fury of storm, and they sing soft and sweet when the water is so calm it seems that the waves are slumbering. And then she heard a voice that was rising above the others. It was confident and clear and strong and heartfelt. It was the most beautiful singing Marvorin had ever heard. She knew she had to find the owner of that voice, no matter what the cost, no matter what the risk. So she spun herself an emerald green gown out of seaweed. She trimmed it with sea foam that looked like lace. She wore pearls around her neck and tied netting around her hair. Then she rose up out of the water and walked across the land, following the sound of that voice, to the little village of Zennor, till she stood in front of the oaken door of the church of Saint Zennara. She opened up that door, and the sound of that music washed over her. She sat down in the very last pew of the church to listen. And when a young man named Matthew sang a particularly moving verse, Marverna let out a little sigh. It was as soft as a whisper, but Matthew heard it. He turned and looked. Marvorin raised her head to look at Matthew, and the netting slipped from her hair. It showed that her hair was wet and gleaming. Her eyes were as green as the sea, her lips as red as coral, her skin like mother of pearl. And Matthew knew the moment he saw her that he loved her. But Marvorin was worried that when her veil slipped, when her netting slipped on her head and showed that her hair was wet, it had given away her disguise. So she was anxious to get away before anyone could stop her. She left the church and returned to the sea. But she came back every now and then because she couldn't keep away. She needed to hear Matthew sing with that incredible voice of his. And whenever she came, she would sit in the very last pew. She would always leave before the service was over to return to the sea. Now she had attracted the attention of everyone in the town. They all wondered who she was, where she could have come from. They had never seen her before, and they had never had so fine and fancy a lady in their little village before. Sometimes after the service was over, people would run to the top of the hill to try and see if they could catch sight of her and find out what direction she was going in, to learn where she was from. But Marvorin was always careful to guard her secret. But Matthew devised a simple but determined plan of his own. The next time Marvorin appeared in the church, sitting in the very last pew, as soon as Matthew finished his solo and saw Marvorin sneak outside, he left the church as well, and he pursued her. Marvorin was nervous and frightened, seeing Matthew chase her, and she ran trying to get away. But she wasn't used to traversing the land, and she tripped over her gown. And when she fell, Matthew saw her fish's tail. She said, "I am a creature of the sea. I cannot stay. I have to go back to where I belong." But it didn't matter to Matthew. He picked her up in his arms and held her and said, "Then I will go with you, for it is with you that I belong." Holding Marvorin in his arms, he walked with her into the sea. Matthew was never seen in Zennor again. The people of Zennor wondered long and often what had ever happened to Matthew. Why would he leave? Where would he go? How could he just disappear? What had happened to him? But no one knew. Until one day, a ship anchored in Pendower Cove. The captain had just had his breakfast, and he was sitting in a chair on deck, relaxing, when all of a sudden, he heard a voice calling him from the sea. He looked, and he saw a mermaid in the water, with her long hair drifting about her. And she called up to him and said, "Excuse me, but would you please raise your anchor? It's resting on the door to my home. Matthew, my husband, can't get out with our children, and I can't get in." Now when the captain heard this, well, he knew to be wary of mermaids. After all, she could raise a storm at sea. She could cause the ship bad luck. So right away he weighed anchor. And the sailors, they worked hard and fast to bring that anchor up just as quickly as they could. The ship moved on a little further along Pendower Cove to deeper water and dropped anchor again. Now, the captain visited Zennor from time to time, and so he made it a point that day to go into the village and tell the people of Zennor what had happened to Matthew, that he had married a mermaid and was living with her under the sea. Matthew never forgot the people he left behind in Zennor. He would sing sweet and high if the weather was to be fair, and he would sing deep and low if Lear, king of the sea, was going to raise a storm that day. And so by listening to Matthew's singing, the fishermen of Zennor always knew when it was safe to go out to sea and when it was best to stay anchored snug at home. In order to commemorate these strange events, and to warn other young men about the dangers of mermaids. They carved an image of a mermaid on the end of the very last pew in the church at Zennor, the very pew where Marvorin had always sat to listen to Matthew sing. The carving is of a mermaid showing her fish's tail, holding a comb in one hand and a mirror in the other. The carving is over 600 years old, and if you go to St. Zennara's church in the village of Zennor in Cornwall, you can still see that carving today on what the locals call the Mermaid's Chair.